Middle East security is in focus as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mike Pompeo meet in Israel, echoing their mutual appreciation for the strong relationship between Jerusalem and Washington. We'll bring you the latest. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan is warning that Ankara will relaunch its ground offensive in northern Syria if the United States doesn't stick to an agreement after 120 hours. And chaos in Beirut as Lebanese citizens take to the streets in protest of Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, with a major announcement expected from him shortly. We'll have the very latest on the unravelling situation there. Hello, I'm Sarah Coates. Thanks for joining me. We begin here in the region where US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Israel following meetings in Turkey. It's understood that Pompeo may have come to brief the Israeli leadership on the deal agreed in Ankara on Syria, but also to try and calm those who are worried in Jerusalem about the American withdrawals in the area. I-24 News defense correspondent Jonathan Regev with the story.
It was a warm welcome, as always when Secretary Pompeo comes to Israel. He was even taken to a tabernacle to learn of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, the Feast of the Tabernacles, which is currently being celebrated.
When you put the stuff at the top, it's supposed to be porous enough so you can see the stars.
But under the surface, there is great concern in Jerusalem from the latest American moves in the Middle East. Just like the entire world, Israel found itself surprised by the hasty American withdrawal from northern Syria, and is worried by its implications. Pompeo is well aware of those concerns and made sure to say the words his hosts wanted to hear.
We talked about all the efforts we've made to push back against the threat, not only to Israel, but to the region and the world from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Reassuring words, but they may not be enough. Israel is especially concerned by possible further U.S. withdrawals in Syria, especially along the border with Iraq. The American presence there is what allows Israel, allegedly, to operate in the area and strike Iranian proxies. But even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu knows that another surprise from Washington could very well be underway, leaving Israel to deal with this threat all alone.
We always remember and apply the basic principle that guides us. Israel will defend itself by itself against any threat.
Russia, Iran, and now Turkey seem to be reshaping Syria as they wish, following years of civil war. With the U.S. almost out of the big picture, Israel understands that the future shape is not exactly what it wanted.
And for more on this story, let's bring in our Middle East correspondent Emily Rose and our defence correspondent Daniel Semach. Thank you both so much for joining me. Daniel, I want to start with you. Tell me, what is the situation on the ground at this very hour? We are hearing reports of fresh strikes and also perhaps chemical weapons being used.
Yeah, we do have reports certainly of renewed airstrikes by Turkish forces and Turkish-backed forces throughout the region that is supposed to be under the ceasefire zone in northeastern Syria. We understand that according to the Syrian Human Rights Observatory, we're talking about 5 fatalities as a result of those airstrikes in an area close to Rais Al Ain, which has been a very active arena for the fighting that we've seen over the past several days. And in regards to these reports of chemical weapons, Foreign Policy magazine, a U.S.-based media outlet, definitely suggesting that there was white phosphorus used by Turkish proxies against Kurdish forces and even civilians, showing images of children being burned. Now, from what we understand, the UN has not confirmed the use of chemical weapons for now. Obviously, we'll be looking very closely at that if that indeed changes, but there are definitely claims that the Turkish proxies are using white phosphorus, which could be qualified as a chemical weapon against Kurdish forces and even civilians.
And Daniel, tell me, with this US pullout from the north of Syria, how concerned is Israel that this may then trigger more of a pullout from US troops from Syria and also from the greater region?
Overall, it's a situation that's definitely concerning the Israeli defense establishment. We've seen that evidence by the various meetings that have been held over the past week, from the IDF chief of staff who met with one of his predecessors, Benny Gantz, who's the leader of the Blue and White Party, just a few days ago. Of course, the meeting today with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as the meeting with Secretary of State Pompeo and the head of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad, Yossi Cohen. They met for around 40 minutes today. So definitely a lot to discuss given the reshaping and the reformation of northeastern Syria as a result of what we've seen over the past week and a half. And it's definitely a situation that the Israeli defense establishment as a whole is watching quite closely, particularly when we're talking about concerns whether or not Iran could exploit the situation.
Of course, and Pompeo is meeting with Netanyahu, has met with Netanyahu to talk about all of that. Daniel, tell me, how likely is it that Iran may use this situation to gain more of a foothold in the region?
Well, I think that that's probably what Israel would be preparing for, and it's certainly a possibility. Whether or not it'll happen, obviously, we'll be watching very closely to see how the Syrian forces and Russian forces remobilize as a result of what's expected or supposed to be, let's say, 120-hour ceasefire. We still have a lot of forces on the ground in that area in very close proximity to one another. But once they clear out, there's definitely a concern that Iran could fill a void and have a sort of landlocked area that they could take advantage of for weapons transfers and things of that sort.
Certainly a lot of concern from Israel, Daniel. And of course, all of this as Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan is warning that Ankara will relaunch its ground offensive in northern Syria if the United States doesn't stick to an agreement after 120 hours, adding that Turkish forces will not withdraw. Speaking to reporters in Istanbul earlier today, Erdogan came out to address Turkey's pause to allow for YPG forces to withdraw from the planned safe zone.
The issue of the safe zone will be solved if the U.S. can realize their promises until Tuesday night, when these 120 hours are over. But if these promises are not realized, as soon as the 120 hours are over, our operation of Peace Spring will continue more rapidly than before. We have no goal to remain in those areas. We are not there, actually. But we also discussed this with Mr. Putin. If terror groups are cleared from Ain al-Arab or Kobani, there will be no problem.
And Emily, I want to bring you into the conversation now. We've just heard there from Erdogan. If indeed Turkey does pick up its operation on the ground there and the US doesn't stick to its end of the bargain, what can we expect that to look like?
Yes, I've heard different analysts talk about what are Erdogan's goals in this area. One such goal could be to try to conquer in a liminal way this area, this territory, and put it under a kind of military control. And Turkey does have the ability to do that, at which point you would see kind of a military occupation in the hopes of perhaps in years having a liminal government and then a transfer of power. Another option could be that Turkey wants to keep this zone uninhabitable and thus will keep extending a sort of long-term war, keeping these people under fire, constant strikes, and thus deterring refugees. This is very important for the Turks, but thus deterring Syrian refugees from making their way up to the border and trying to cross into Turkey. And then the other goal could very well be just to try to put pressure on the Kurds in the area to withdraw, to back away, and stay clear of Turkey's border. So any kinds of military gains that Erdogan sees fit to gain here, it looks like that as of this moment, he does indeed have the upper hand.
And Emily, I think the big question is, you know, many people across the world are asking, many people are highly concerned, what is the fate of the Kurds?
So this is the major question, because if we remember, the United States doesn't have a great history of showing support for the Kurds and then sticking to it. Even historically, after World War I, the United States backed a Kurdish state on the face of it and then kind of walked back from that. And there's a history of mistrust, and that mistrust isn't just rippling with the Kurds, it's rippling throughout all U.S. allies across the world. So at this very moment, if the Kurds are given an ultimatum, they could withdraw perhaps to Kurdish areas of Iraq. They could try to withdraw further into a more war-torn Syria, but of course then they face Assad's military, not too good prospects there. And really this, though, leaves them vulnerable and very open at the hands of the Turkish authorities, which again, and we've stressed this several times, Turkey views them as a branch of their own terrorist organizations and will not take kindly or likely to them being on their border.
Certainly a very concerning situation on the ground. Emily Rose, Daniel Semak, always a pleasure. Thank you. And we are going out for a short break. When we come back, huge protests continue in Lebanon, with its Prime Minister expected to make an announcement soon. All of that, plenty more. Stay with us.
unflinching, outspoken, and to the point. The most complete coverage of the day's events. Weeknights, watch Crossroads for analysis, interviews, and reporting that connects us to the Middle East and the world. Watch Crossroads, 6 p.m. Eastern, only on I-24 News.
On Stateside, it's not just about delivering the news. It's about giving meaning to the news and doing so with clarity.
These families waiting to get into the country, how long will they be in detention?
What happens around the rest of the world can have a huge impact on the United States. And what happens in the United States can have a huge impact on the rest of the world. That's Stateside.
Our world is moving so fast. The internet, social media, blogger spin, and opinion. Where do you turn for the real story? The latest information, expert analysis, and a fresh perspective on the trending news of the day. I'm Derek Dennis. Give me 30 minutes. Take 30. Only on I-24 News.
From Hollywood to the Holy Land. We bring you all that's trending in lifestyle, arts, entertainment, and technology. Speaking to the culture catalysts which create, innovate, and inspire. Plus, what's turning heads in the social sphere. If it's creating a buzz, we've got it covered. Tune into Trending, only on I-24 News.
Welcome back. Let's go now to Lebanon, where reports are coming in that its Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri could resign, with huge protests erupting. And we are seeing live images coming in now for the second day running in Beirut, with citizens there demonstrating against government policy and the state of the economy. Angry crowds are taking to the streets, with thousands of people joining in, blocking roads and burning tyres, with the country descending into chaos. The protests causing Hariri to cancel a cabinet meeting as people make their voices heard.
We've lived here for 30 years with their lies. They're sitting in their castles at the expense of the people. Their cars are at the expense of the people. We are dying from hunger while they eat the best food and their children study in the best universities.
We're here to say enough of this persistent theft and stealing. Enough of all this unfair state, of all of them. We're not with anyone, we're against everyone.
And for more, let's bring in Emily Rose, our Middle East correspondent, once again. Emily, we are seeing very dramatic live images coming in there from Lebanon. Tell me, many protests. What are the main things that people there want changed?
So, Sarah, essentially the Lebanese economy is absolutely in shambles. Just to give you an example, under the age of 35, the unemployment rate is 37%. And if you noticed in those visuals there, in those clips, we can see a lot of young people taking to the streets. That's also indicative of what we see now on Twitter and on Lebanese social media. These are young people who are very angry, and they're protesting on non-sectarian lines. We're seeing it come from the Christian population, from the Muslim Sunni population, from the Muslim Shiite population. They are angry about the economic conditions or lack thereof in the country, and they're expressing that, as you mentioned, through protests. The banks were closed today, schools, roads were blocked, and they've really succeeded at bringing the country to a halt.
So tell me, what is it really that's caused the economy to spiral into such a downfall? Why has it become so bad?
Yes, Lebanon is in a downward spiral, and it has been for years. Starting with the Lebanese Civil War, there wasn't a lot done to try to make the economy recuperate itself. Then again, several years later, a very bloody war with Israel, which also took its toll on the Lebanese economy. And then an influx of refugees, most recently from the Syrian Civil War, has served to even further bring the Lebanese economy to its knees, to shambles. So nothing really done to boost the economy. And then on top of that, if you or I went shopping today at a store in Lebanon, what we would mostly see are products that come from outside, from France or imported from other countries. Lebanon doesn't really have its own mechanism for creating products itself and doing its own, creating its own infrastructure on the ground. So very hard economic conditions there, and not a lot being done by the government to create a sustainable economy.
So So what about the timing of these protests? Why are people coming out now? Why didn't they come out earlier?
The trigger, as it seems on the face of it, was a planned tax by the government on WhatsApp conversations that are done over a phone application on WhatsApp. And that really sat not well. It angered the Lebanese population, almost perhaps because the Lebanese population is a bit more open to media and to social media than a lot of the other countries we see in the Middle East. So particularly the idea of WhatsApp being charged was a trigger. But like I said, for the most part, this is anger that has been bubbling under the surface because of the dire economic conditions.
Well, it certainly will be interesting to see what Hariri has to say and if these protests do indeed continue. Emily Rose, thank you. Let's go now to Washington, D.C., where the world's biggest weapons manufacturers have been showing off their products in America's capital. And a senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv, explains high tension in the world can lead to high profits for gun makers.
It's the third of 3 days of AUSA, the annual meeting of the Association of the United States Army. This has become an arms expo, showing the ingenuity and sales techniques of one of the most lucrative industries in human history. Among the exhibits, inventions and updated weapons that often start as secret projects, but now are offered for sale on the global arms market. Manufacturers and developers in Israel have a respected role in this marketplace. Through their American subsidiaries, they're selling to America. Rafael, famous for creating the Iron Dome defense system against rockets at IAI North America, the former Israel Aircraft Industries, there's an emphasis on low cost and customizing for customers.
Israeli technology has a reputation for being highly innovative, highly capable, and rapidly brought to market given the constant threat that Israel faces. On 1/10 the American budget.
That's a retired U.S. Air Force officer, Swami Iyer, the chief executive of IAI North America, still selling UAVs known as drones, and now a fleet of self-driving attack platforms. This is also an excellent time to sell armaments to the United States, because President Donald Trump has proudly boosted defense spending, claiming that U.S. forces were out of ammunition when he came into office, but now are the mightiest military on earth. And that is good for business. Dan Raviv, I-24 News, Washington.
We move now to the latest in the international trade war, with US President Donald Trump today slamming tariffs on the European Union worth $7.5 billion. Now, the story behind it involves airplanes and olives. And to break it all down for us in the studio is our international affairs correspondent, Bianca Zanini. Bianca, thank you for joining me. Tell me, how did a case involving billions of dollars worth of aircraft produce end up becoming olives and cheese?
Well, Sarah, it all goes back to this feeling that Donald Trump repeats often again and again, that the U.S. is being treated unfairly and that the best way to solve a problem is to slam tariffs on it, right? The World Trade Organization earlier this week authorized Washington to put these tariffs on the European Union because they said that Airbus, which is owned by others, by France and Germany, Spain, they said that Airbus has been receiving subsidies, which gave them an unfair advantage over the competitor, which is the American Boeing. And so Trump is slamming these tariffs that are now going to affect produce like olives and wine and cheese in the European Union, and the European Union has already said they're going to retaliate. So this is going to be a tit for tat, a tit for tat. They have a counter case going on, and we're going to see this continue and expanding. And as we see in this next report, it could have some really widespread consequences, Sarah.
Italian cheese, French wine, and Spanish olives. U.S. President Donald Trump is punishing the European Union by slamming tariffs on a record $7.5 billion worth of European products, expected to hit small businesses across Europe hard.
The survival of the olive grower is in danger. We cannot compete with the oils that are bringing from abroad. We cannot compete with the new plantations. We cannot compete with the tariffs that Mr. Trump has placed on us. That's choking us, and it's really dangerous.
The tariffs come as retaliation for billions of dollars in subsidies given to aerospace manufacturer Airbus. The World Trade Organization confirmed the subsidies gave the aircraft producer an unfair advantage over American competitor Boeing. The countries behind Airbus, Britain, France, Germany, and Spain, will be hit even harder by Trump's tariffs.
A loss in product consumption, such as table olives, will mean more unemployment in Andalusia and in Spain in general.
Many European producers feel they're caught in a political dispute about aircrafts that has nothing to do with them, and that could have even larger repercussions.
Why do we want to be in the European Union if this happens in the future? I believe that this can do much more social damage than many people think.
This move by the Trump administration is just the latest in a series of international trade battles plaguing the global economy, causing rising tensions between the U.S. and the European Union, as well as China. Brussels expects to retaliate with its own tariffs, meaning the international trade war and its consequences will most likely continue.
In Europe, a trial has begun for a Nazi camp guard. It could be Germany's last prosecution of a living Nazi, with attorneys fearing that he may not even live long enough to hear the verdict. I-24 News correspondent Ariel Levin-Waldman reports.
The defendant is accused of being an accessory to murder in 5,230 cases. As a member of the SS Guard, he is believed to have supported the systematic, malicious and cruel killing, especially of Jewish prisoners, at Stutthof concentration camp.
Bruno is being tried in youth court. He was only 17 years old when he stood in a death camp watchtower. Now it is uncertain if he will survive long enough to hear the verdict.
I have to choose between a trial and no punishment, and no trial and no punishment. I think it's obvious what the choice is.
The trial is to determine whether Bruno had a choice in his post as a death camp guard. Such guards were drawn from the SS, volunteers that could request alternate postings instead and were usually sent to the front lines.
The task in this trial will be to find out if the accused had an alternative. The prosecutor's office knows of no case where a guard was killed because he refused duty.
Now the court asked, did Bruno choose a place in the machinery of genocide to keep himself safe from combat? Or was he a fervent believer in the Nazi cause?
It's really our last chance to ever hear from someone who was a guard at a concentration camp, and to understand, how does someone become a guard at a concentration camp? What was it like to be a guard? Why did they do this?
There are 29 open cases in Germany against people accused of facilitating the Holocaust, and no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity.
Moving on, and the International Space Station has produced its first beefsteak. That's right, stem cell steak manufactured in zero gravity, and it happened thanks to technology developed by an Israeli startup.
And liftoff.
Cows in space. Well, their cells at least. The Soyuz MS-15 en route to the International Space Station, on board bovine cells, cultivated from a breed found in the Rehovot region in Israel.
What was really exciting and moving for me was the launch of the rocket. When we saw our cells kind of, taking off and entering the outer atmosphere and getting into space.
Didier Toubia is the co-founder of Aleph Farms, an Israeli startup that cultures stem cells in labs to make humanely produced steak. A year ago, he was contacted by a Russian company that manufactures 3D bioprinters to take it one step further, synthesize the meat aboard the International Space Station.
The experiment has been performed by our partners 3D bioprinting, which have that bioprinter, that unique magnetic bioprinter on the International Space Station. And we've been in touch with them on a current basis. And we're excited to wait until the results. And we've been very happy with the successful completion of that first experiment.
During the 12-hour experiment, astronauts managed to 3D print a tissue consisting of several types of cells that reproduce the texture of real meat. All this under controlled microgravity conditions 250 miles above any natural resources on Earth. An important breakthrough for NASA. The goal is to create meat that perfectly reproduces the flavor, texture, and natural taste of beef. without any additives or dyes. Ala Farms hopes to release its steak commercially in 2023, and hopefully you won't have to journey to space to taste it.
And we're seeing live images coming in right now from the International Space Station, where astronauts Christina Koch and Jessica Meir have ventured outside to fix a power controller which failed, a milestone for females in that role. Now, over the last half a century, spacewalks like this have only been done by men, but these women you can see are making history, with the 4 men aboard the space station staying indoors. The spacewalk is Koch's 4th and Meir's 1st, with people around the world tuning in to watch the event. And that is all we have time for this edition of I-24 News. I'm Sarah Coates. Thanks for watching.